We're live now.
Greetings to everybody joining us today. Thank you for participating in this first of a series of monthly events that we're organizing here at the World Smart Cities Forum. My name is Gordon Feller. I'm serving as your moderator for the online community that we've built, which I hope all of you will have a chance to join us at. That's available to you at worldsmartcity.org. And we've built a Hangouts page there, so worldsmartcities.org/groups/Hangouts is the place where you can find the video of today's program later and the link to YouTube. But first, let me welcome you for our 1-hour session today. We're focused on the pain points, and particularly the pain points that have to be addressed if we're serious about building smart cities around the world, and we're going to focus today on the special challenges associated with urban mobility. We'll start with an introduction that I'm doing with you now. We'll move to a presentation by our special guest, and then we'll finish for about 20 minutes of Q&A. But first, let me introduce Sylvia to you, who you see on the screen. She's sitting in the UK, and she's our master producer for this event. She and I and the rest of us organizing today have to apologize in advance because many of us are new to using Google Hangouts, and we wanted to make sure that we had a chance to explore new technology. For those of you who are new to this, we can't promise, of course, that your connection is going to be superb throughout the hour, but we hope certainly that you won't see any technical glitches or interruptions. But we've created this program to accommodate your questions, your comments, and we have 2 channels by which you can make your comments and questions visible to us. First is through our Twitter feed, which is World Smart City 2016, and you can find that at Twitter and make your comments visible to everybody watching that feed. And you have the option on the group chat function at the lower right in the box in blue on your Google Hangout page. We would ask you when you join, those of you who will be connected to us by audio, to make sure to mute yourself when you're not speaking. And we would ask you to be mindful of anybody else who's speaking so that we don't have people talking over each other. It's always a challenge with these kinds of audio or video conferences, but we know everybody's going to try their best. We really have 2 groups joining us today. One is on the call listening, and another is on video that you'll see at the bottom of your screen joining us midstream. So I don't want to delay us any further from our special guest, and we're very grateful to have Graham with us today. Let me introduce him officially and tell you a little bit about Graham and his work. He's sitting in the UK today. He's an international business leader and a partner and co-founder of a company called UrbanDNA. He has a wealth of cross-sector experience that ranges from concepts to operations. He's lived and worked in multiple countries. He had field development roles with Shell, the oil giant, and he's had global leadership roles in Capgemini, the consulting and information technology company. And he formed UrbanDNA as a specialist cities-focused partnership. He's driving Global Smart Cities agenda through a variety of positions, one with the European Commission's own Smart Cities and Communities Innovation Partnership, another with the UK National Government's Ministerial Smart Cities Forum, and several others, including the nonprofit City Protocol Society and the UK City Standards Institute. We asked Graham to join us here today because he's playing a leading role in advising, shaping, and delivering smart city programs, not just to cities, but also to large multinational organizations. He brings a wealth of experience, of a passion to make sure that the delivery of these ideas in the real world happens. So without any further ado, let me turn the floor over and the microphone over to Graham to present you with his thoughts about the future of smart cities and the pain points that cities, that we who are trying to build smart cities have to confront. Graham, thanks to you.
Gordon, thank you very much indeed for the introduction, and welcome everybody to the call. The first thing I would say is that I am probably a good generalist and not a mobility expert, but rather like everybody else, we suffer from the same challenges as we travel around our cities. So the pain point of mobility is clearly one of those that I bump into on a very, very regular basis. I've got a set of slides which I'd like to take people through and use that as a basis to kind of tee up the conversation. So let me, with no further ado, put that on screen for folks. There we go. So hopefully now you'll be seeing the first of those, the title page. So the title page says Urban Mobility at the Cusp of a New Transformation. And I kind of genuinely believe that with what is going on in the world in terms of the growth of data and a lot of the new technologies, we may well indeed be at the start of something which is a genuine and new transformation in terms of transport, urban mobility and transport. There we go, so page down works slowly. There are a few topics I thought I'd cover. Just some key messages. First is transport's been around for a long time. So it's chronic, it's complex, it's important, it's in focus currently, and the good news is it's probably fixable as well. So that's basically the storyline of what I'd like to take you through quite rapidly. And let's go back to the beginning. So Rome, very few people remember that Rome was actually a massive city in the first century, 1.6 million people, and probably our first candidate for congestion. What we've learned to do since then is to build roads and build roads wider, and they become used. So we build them wider and they become more busy, and that whole cycle continues. Somewhere along the line, we need to figure out how to shift and change that cycle. And I think that now is probably a very good time to do that, particularly as in my lifetime, and possibly some of yours, the population of the world will treble, something that I wake up in the morning occasionally and think quite hard about. The result of which is that this sort of picture of mass congestion is becoming very real on a regular basis. Obviously, it transpires in different cities around the world, in different forms and in different times. But without any doubt, this chronic issue is now massive. It's now got an enormous environmental impact, and it's going to cause us to have a significant rethink in terms of what we do about things. Now, I don't want to go through the details on this slide, but I've got a couple of slides that really talk to transport in context, and I think that's important. So at the top of the screen, always look to cities in terms of what do they want to be. They want to provide good quality of life and living for people, and obviously an economic environment which is good. And if you cascade down from that, some of the features and functions and principles that underpin that, the picture becomes quite complex quite rapidly, and transport's right in the middle of that. So at a level where you're looking at some of the various different city services that exist, social care, education, healthcare, utilities, culture, leisure, that sort of thing, transport itself is interconnected across a lot of those. If I go down one level deeper, and this you probably can't see, and that's also on purpose, the key aspect there is the need to take a systemic view of transport within the context of city services, and they're all interconnected. So bad environmental planning and bad transport planning has an enormous issue on health, but the issue on health is measured in a different way and has different temporal connections to it. Understanding that was something which I guess people did intuitively in the past, and now we need to do it in a more engineered, a more systemic manner. So that's some stuff in terms of it's chronic and it's complicated. If we now move to the topic of it's important, there are a few pictures here in terms of surveys that are done by various different people that look to what should the main mayoral priorities be, and lo and behold, mobility and transport comes up. Number one, what are some of the infrastructural investments and priorities for investors, and by far mobility is in there. So transport is one of those topics which is at the core of city building and city rebuilding. Oops, there's technology at work. Get rid of that. So it's important, always with such things, is the need to actually understand who's doing well. There's some interesting work done by Arthur D. Little, who are one of the advisory firms that is looking at mobility amongst other services. And they've identified by region or by geography cities that are doing particularly well and perhaps some that are doing not so well. And this chart looks to those cities in Western Europe and Western world where there are a fair number of cities that are considered to be doing well on, I think there's 20 or so indicators that ADL were looking at. And also there's some interesting ones in Asia Pacific, like sort of Hong Kong and Singapore, that are examples of cities doing particularly well. And unfortunately, in Gordon, and you sit in North America at the moment, the US cities are not perhaps the front runners in terms of performance on mobility. So just a few excuse me, just a second, I'll close the door, there's a bit of background noise. Apologies for that. So some city examples. I've picked up half a dozen or so here, both good and not so good. So Hong Kong, a very, very dense city, but with what they've done and also with geographical setting, low CO2, they've got some smart multimodal cards, so they're using the shift of people to public transport, which is something which they have a lot of out there, and they have a very low car ownership, also supported by dense cities. So from that standpoint, a place to look. Take from Hong Kong to shall we say, the Nordic countries like Stockholm and Copenhagen, where there's a big shift towards bike usage and such like. Amsterdam, likewise, and also low car ownership population. So the likes of Amsterdam, Stockholm, and Copenhagen I'd offer forward from the US perspective as particularly good examples of shift of mode from cars to public transport to non-hydrocarbon and non-polluting vehicles. Vienna, another well-advanced city with high public transport usage. And then some examples there from the States, Atlanta, 95% of journeys are by car, the result of which is an enormous CO2 charge and also high fatality rate, though they've got fairly reasonable journey times. The issues here are it's about multiple modes, about different cultural norms, about different physical setups of cities. So being a good performer, the context of the city is clearly vital, and the culture of the people. And so this change that we face at the moment is absolutely not one which is solely about technology. It is enormously about people and how people interact with each other and with the infrastructure environment within and city within which they live. So it's in focus. A few slides in terms of whether we can do stuff about it. I've popped one down here which hopefully provides some kind of strategic framework for that. So 4 areas that we're exploring here. One is the contextual things, some of which I touched on. Different visions, different strategies, different policies and politics, different convening power, shall we say, of City Hall, and importantly also, and particularly importantly these days, different business models and different access to funds. So there's some contextual factors that have an enormous impact in terms of the ability of a city to shift the way it moves people around. The second area is that of engagement. So what is it that you can do on the demand side? And that, I think, is probably the largest factor. I look to a simple city like, or not a simple city, but a simple example of a city, Bordeaux in France. At the last mayoral race, one mayoral candidate said, we're a large French city, we've got a bit of a congestion problem, so I think, like all other large cities, we should have a ring road. And the contesting candidate said, wait a second, if I could get 7 people in every 5 cars as opposed to 6 people in every 5 cars through car sharing, then we wouldn't need a ring road. So it's these sorts of demand measures which will make an enormous impact on how we use infrastructure efficiently. So that for me is probably the new vital thing, and clearly technology and mobile and all the things that we carry around with us and the data that's around can inform us that much better. The third area is that of multimodal. So how can you look to integrate information and integrate across different infrastructures? Just think of the journeys that you face in the city that you may well live in or visit. There's payment aspects that influence your choice of mode. There's the ability or not to shift between modes at different hubs that make a big difference. And also there's the non-people aspect in terms of freight and freight consolidation, the mass increase in our cities of white vans driving around for delivery and such like that we need to think about. So there's the engagement and demand side, there's the integration across multiple modes, and then there's also that aspect of just reimagining what new technologies will bring. So electric vehicles, that clearly has an environmental benefit, sustainable fuels, likewise. Planning changes, smart planning, intelligent roads, basically taking the same infrastructure but actually moving the lanes and roads. Kinetic energy storage, which is very early on in its days. But there's a lot of things that may change aspects, and drones, which we all know and worry about as well. So a framework to help think through how cities can move forward on that. And moving on from that, just a few very quick examples of cities that may have done things that I think are rather well. Well, I live in London, and King's Cross Station used to be a transport hub, which was an appalling place to visit 10 years ago. Scruffy, inefficient, badly informed, unsafe, and it's been completely transformed to a hub which is actually a real pleasure to visit, and that's part of the whole aspect of redevelopment. And there's some wonderful work that's being done by some of the universities to look to how cities are really transforming using the public hubs, many of which are railways, to actually create them as nice places so people are a lot more predisposed to actually get involved in public transport and more informed in terms of that modal shift. But it's just not just in Europe. There's some very recent planning work that I was looking at in Bangalore, where they're looking again at trying to connect in a space and place-based way the various different aspects of how they can put transport measures around in terms of existing traffic and traffic calming and such like, and connect up multi-mode between public and private sectors. So the transport hub and transport hub planning, I think, is important. I've just pulled a chart here. It's slightly old data in terms of car sharing. A statistic: I think it's 94%, depending whether you measure it, of cars are actually sitting idle for all of their life. So that's an enormous asset that can be used. People don't really care so much these days in terms of owning the asset of the car, as opposed to earlier on 20, 30 years ago. So the car is seen in a different paradigm, and you can bring new companies and new business models to bear, whereby car sharing, and particularly electric vehicle car sharing, can make a marked impact in terms of how cities use the private sector and to a certain extent the club side of car transport on the roads. The shift in terms of bicycles, I've mentioned Copenhagen, Amsterdam as examples of that. Bike sharing, electric bike sharing is something that we see happening a lot in Europe, and I would imagine is also beginning to pick up in other aspects of the world. And some charts here that show how a high shift e-cycle, e-bike mode can actually really help to provide an alternative, healthy, importantly, means of travel around cities. This is an institutional view, shall we say, in terms of what, and I don't apologize here, it's the European Commission. I live in Europe, so I know a bit more about what's going on here. There's two programs that are picked up there. One is Civitas, which is a network of cities that have been addressing for a decade or so a large number of measures, so something like 700 or so measures in terms of various different aspects of how transport and mobility around cities can be improved. So a wonderful database of good ideas, and an institution like the Commission that convenes Europe to bring that together. More recently, the European Innovation for Partnership on Smart Cities and Communities has also got one of their 6 different action cluster areas, which is about sustainable urban mobility. And the specific focus of that is around electric vehicles and energy and such like. So there's a high focus on electric vehicles for smart cities, and also for mobility solutions. So using mobile and data to inform people better to help that whole process. So big institutions like European Commission, I'm sure the World Bank and various others will get behind these sorts of things, particularly in terms of World Bank, around the investments, the massive investments that they put to the developing countries like India and such like. In terms of some aspects of road transport, shall we say, the good old parking problem, congestion is significantly affected by people that are driving around looking for parking spots. So imagine what we can do with sensor technology, which isn't about the parking place, it's actually about the space that's available, such that, for instance, if you're driving into a city in a Hummer, which is kind of large, or in one of the little smart cars, you can actually then get data that tells you to park in a particular place, or gives you the number of spaces that may be available to you. Cities now looking at sensors, at camera technologies, at car-to-car, infrastructure car-to-car, different Internet of Things technologies in terms of physical hardware, in terms of the IT services, the data platforms, and how you operate those sorts of things, particularly in terms of, shall we say, public-private partnerships in cities to actually try and fundamentally change a chronic issue in cities, which is the example of parking that I show here. Intelligent transport systems, so likewise taking it from parking to how you deal with the flow of traffic through cities. Copenhagen is a good example of this, where they have got street traffic lights which will push information to cyclists to tell them to pedal harder, to get to the light such that it's on green, that will interface with large trucks which are going through the city that are high polluters, and similarly adjust their speed. So pass information to the driver, and indeed public transport, you can provide priority means for public transport so that you can actually smooth the flow through the city. So the combination of using digitization, various different technologies to manage the flow and to provide some prioritization for various different types of flow, different modes in other words, and take cars off the road in terms of parking and such like, can be a mid-term opportunity for cities to move forward. So a bit of a busy slide in terms of a variety of different things, instruments, modes that cities can look at: car sharing, emergency pathways, multimodal journey planning, business parking for logistics and such like, different parking apps, dealing with occasional events that take place in cities so that they can manage peaks better, and also provide better information for tourists. All of these are things which, importantly, are dealing with organizations that typically wouldn't necessarily work together. So there's a whole collaboration agenda here that brings new players into the scene, which is both a challenge and an opportunity. Payment card companies that suddenly are moving into transport, automotive companies that are looking to streetlights and electric vehicle charging. So the roles and the capabilities of the players, it's an interesting mix that we're seeing at the moment. So just in conclusion then, last slide, things that I see important. So collaboration is absolutely vital to make this work. Collaboration within the demand, the people side, with the supply side in industry, with leadership of city, and very, very importantly these days, with investors. What we tend to have done over the last 5-10 years is we get cities and industry together. They determine that they want to do something and then discover they don't have money, and investors come along and say, I don't understand. So the opportunity to bring the funders, the investors, to the discussion very early so they can help shape different business models, different funding mechanisms is very, very important. Second key point here is around systems thinking. So I'll go back to some of the earlier slides. Intuition, good professional judgment of the transport engineer is not going to cut it these days. And there's a need to involve a larger number of players, larger number of actors, skill them up, and systems thinking and frameworks and such like provide wonderful means to actually help to work across the silos and make sense of things. And I think, you know, playing that into the standardization discussion and agenda, there's a huge opportunity for standardization organizations to actually bring these trusted frameworks to the fore on top of the existing inventory of, shall we say, technical standards that exist. A digital first philosophy, I think, is something which is vital for us to embrace the future. The example of Bordeaux, the example of how we can use digital means, data-driven means, IoT, sensors, to fundamentally change, indeed transform the mobility and transport system is an important philosophy. It's the starting point, digital first, a good thing to start with. And I think the final point is that of demand aggregation. So in most parts of the world, the majority of people don't live in the large cities. The large cities typically have capacity, they engage with industry. It's really, really important to think of where most people live, which is in mid and small size cities, and they don't have the capacity to move forward, but they do have the problem of ensuring that they have flow of people and goods through the city in a good way. So imagine we could bring cities together to address common solutions, to provide common solutions to common challenges and deliver better outcomes. That would actually get to where the majority of people live. So just in closing, those key points I think are vital. Collaboration, engaging funders early, a systems thinking, a digital first philosophy, demand aggregation, and then finally the role of standards, the standards community to actually provide that trusted guidance, which is not just the technical standards, it's the management frameworks and it's the leadership guides that help city decision makers and industry make the right decisions. So a quick canter around the topic of mobility. I hope that those are useful, and I'm sure that the slides will all be made available over the web. Thank you for that, and perhaps I could pass it back to Gordon for moderating some questions.
Thank you, Graham. Much appreciated. I am particularly pleased that we were able to touch on, I would say, 10 of the major themes. You were able to touch on at least 10 of the major themes that have become part of the discussion for the online community at World Smart City Forum. We have this online community which everybody is encouraged to participate in, and these are some of the themes. The last one, digital first and the role of standards, have become absolutely central to the discussion. So we've got 30 minutes ahead of us for today, but we also have about 4.5–5 months ahead of us for the discussion that leads to our program in Singapore on July 13. So let me start with Paolo Gaudiano's questions from New York. He's with Ecosystem, which is a technology company that works with government agencies and with multinational enterprises, and he had 2 questions which I'll suggest people look at the group chat if they want to follow along. First question is, what are some examples of cities that have done a particularly good job of making use of data, especially across multiple silos? Now, you looked in Graham's presentation, Graham, you looked at mostly the transport use of data and not just transport-related data by cities, but I think Paolo is asking are there cities that are doing a good job, not just in transport, but maybe in energy or in building data or other types of data, cutting across the multiple silos? And maybe we'll start with Paulo's first question to you.
Sure. Yeah, so I gave some examples on the transport side, but yes, indeed, I think that if you look at the silo or the domain of transport, and that's all you look at from the standpoint of data, then you're probably missing a trick. So that, yes, there are some cities that I think are doing particularly well. Last week I was at the launch of London's city data strategy, and I don't know whether it's the first, but it's probably a first of a kind in terms of a city actually putting a data strategy out there, which is very much across all domains and also across all sectors. So that would be one example of a city that's not necessarily using data the best in terms of all cities, but I think is trying to put the foundations in place in terms of governance mechanisms, process, and strategy. New York, Los Angeles, very good examples of cities that have, particularly New York, got a big focus on opening data in terms of data sets. Chicago, from the standpoint of the Chicago Array, around the use of Internet of Things, so that sensor side of things, very experimental and pushing the boundaries. Singapore, I think, is a city that continues to go about its business in a very, very professional and managed fashion, and I'd hold them up as a very good example. And then there's probably led by Barcelona, but a whole bunch of highly enthusiastic and energetic cities in Spain that just get on with it and experiment. Some of those experiments are very successful, some of them less so, but they're learning fast. And then I think there's the Nordic cities where, and this gets onto some other aspects of data, where opening up data in terms of all aspects of data, how much I earn, where I live, all these sorts of things, is very normal in the likes of Stockholm and Oslo and such like. So I think that that aspect of sharing data is something that I see in some of the Nordic countries. Now, clearly I'm not versed completely and globally, and I suspect that in some of the Asia-Pacific cities there'll be some very exciting stuff that we need to learn from as well. So yes, I think the point about not looking at it as just mobility, I think the point about putting a strategy in place and governance mechanisms, and also the delights of experimentation, just getting on with it like the Spanish, is some examples of good practice.
We've had a couple of people ask about your slides and whether they'll be available to download in some format like PDF from the World Smart City Forum website. And Graham, let us know and let the folks who are listening in know whether those slides might be available for people to view on your website or another website.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to share that. I've used and sourced some information from various different parties, and more than happy to keep the dialogue going, both on the World Smart Cities site or directly with people on the slides.
Thanks. So Paulo had one other question, which is about your notion of a city data cube. He is anxious to hear some examples of how you've implemented and applied this concept. If you can talk a little bit about this city data cube.
Yeah, interestingly, so I can't recall the background or the knowledge that Paulo may know about me in the City Data Cube, but interestingly, the idea of the City Data Cube is something which I put out probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was really looking more around assets, so just city assets, cities knowing what they have, where it is, and what nature it is, the characteristics of it. At the moment, cities have silo data, and they capture data, energy on the ontologies and structures that may be associated with energy, transport likewise, healthcare likewise. The idea of the City Data Cube is to try and find the means by which we can put together a framework. And this is where I think, again, standardization organizations play enormous roles, where we can lift up from the minutiae detail and try and pick and collect city data in a way that you could put a cube together, a framework, a wireframe, and populate it with data that you could say, this is good, it's not perfect, it's good, and it's good enough to actually use to help us make decisions. So it's almost like we could think in more than 2 dimensions about New York, for instance, New York's open data in terms of the various different domains that it crosses, but also some other aspects of it so that we can start to fill up that cube. So it's at this stage, it's more a concept. We did apply it in more detailed terms on assets, city assets, and I think that that concept is one which is worthwhile to try and actually help us move the ability to interrogate data across different domains. Now, the danger is we get less lost in lengthy projects. I've reviewed one for the Commission around energy ontologies, where everybody seeks perfection just in the absence of doubt. What we need to do is to move away from that and seek accuracy as opposed to perfection, the Pareto principle.
So before we go to Brandon Payton's question, I'll just ask one follow-up here. A lot of discussion, of course, about the value of the big data that cities are generating, streaming off of their sensors and their assets like parking spaces or traffic lights or outdoor street lights or any number of other city assets that are being lit up and made data rich. Have you seen an example where a city, or maybe it's an enterprise within a city, has done an extremely good job of mining that big data for important real-time insights that help the city to, for instance, manage its traffic better and reduce congestion and reroute flows, or anything else perhaps that is a good example of little insights of value extracted from big data?
Yeah, so that horrible word, big data. A few thoughts come to mind there. One would be, there's a little town in Germany called Darmstadt. Nobody's heard of it, and that's the point. They are actually quite progressive and experimental in terms of, interestingly, here it is about the mobility and transport data to pull together CCTV camera data, induction loops in roads, a variety of different data which includes real-time or near real-time data to try and inform planning decisions and inform operational decisions in the city. So the message behind that is that there are some examples of modest-sized cities where it's actually possible to get your hands around the people and the assets to do that. The second point I'd raise is around data and big data. I like to think of data in 5 different blocks. They're not mutually exclusive, but they are important and different. There's a lot of data which is behind the firewall, particularly public city organizations, some of which should always remain behind the firewall because of sensitivity and data protection issues, but an enormous amount of which is actually just not in the quality level at the moment that actually cities will want to open it. So that behind the firewall data is probably where enormous current amount of data exists that needs cleaned up and needs improved, and it needs shared within the city, and it needs shared across the city and across the sectors. So for me, that's kind of one pot of data which can be characterized in one way. Then
Good.
Open data. Sorry, if I...
Yeah.
Are still
ahead.
on? Yeah. So behind the firewall data, there's open data, examples like New York and London and various other cities that open up their data. That's a very, very small percentage of data. But it is important, and the whole shift from behind the firewall to open is important too. There's commercial data, so city service providers, for which cities through outsourcing, there's a hell of a lot more of them that are actually part of the value chain of data. And that city commercial data behaves differently because it has value attached to it from the organizations involved in it. So behind the firewall, open and commercial data are 3 types that all have different characteristics. And the final 2, one would be social media data, so people, for which we seem to be very happy about sharing our information until the point at which we worry about it, and then we complain massively. But that volume and value, in an engineering sense, value is very low, the volume is very high. And then the final one is sensors and IoT data, which is more structured, engineered, and such like. Now, those are not, as I say, mutually exclusive, but I like to think of city data in those 5 different blocks. Those aren't in the slides, unfortunately, because they behave differently, because they're owned differently, because they have different forms of value and characterization. And in all the work that we tend to do, we try to think through the problem using those 5 different data sources. Added together kind of makes big data. Long answer to a short question.
Well, very, very helpful. Thank you for that. And since all of this discussion about big data and data sets prompts the privacy and data security question, I'll go straight to Brandon's question, because he asks, I think, you know, a very appropriate kind of, raises a very appropriate kind of concern here. And I'm reading his comment and question. I imagine video recognition capabilities being integrated into directing traffic lights, showing available parking, construction, and so forth. But what are your thoughts on the privacy issues people might have with being on camera constantly when in public spaces?
Yeah, this is a really, really important aspect. It bumps into perception and reality. It bumps into perceived regulation and the realities of regulation. And it bumps into what you can do with technology to mask this. There's a wonderful CTO, Andy Mulholland, who once said, let me make this easy for you, Graham. Pigs and sausages. You can turn the pig into a sausage, but you can't reverse the process. And he said you can do that with data as well. So I think that there's a lot of things that one can do with technology that actually manages data appropriately. The damn thing is that the same data will have multiple levels of sensitivity depending on its usage. I think this problem is solvable technically. I think it's solvable through very smart approaches to how you architect data, which is about understanding the business and the business of cities more than it is the technology only. But clearly the technology gurus are going to be key in that. And I think it's also very different contextually in different cultures and societies. Again, I take an example, probably, and in Europe and possibly in the world, the German culture is one of being very, very cautious of sharing information. There's a parking provider that uses camera technologies to look at a space of parking to measure the actual space. So it's very, very accurate, and it has the ability to look into all sorts of different things, but they've managed to adjust their technology such that they're not actually sharing information on the individuals. So face recognition technology used badly, it can be a real killer to what a city wants to do. So, you know, CCTV and finding the people that should be found that have perpetrated and done something wrong is also what CCTV does. We're moving into an innovative area where we're going to have to accept ambiguity and some errors, but I think technically these sorts of things are fixable.
And was the company Streetline that you were referring to?
It wasn't actually. It's what's it called? Name escapes me at the moment. Thomas Horniger is the guy who's the CEO. It's clever City, I think it is.
Okay. Well, it's good to know, you know, which technology providers are struggling with these problems, because some are ignoring it, and it's always good to know who's making attempts here. And speaking of CCTV, we have a question about UK cities, since the UK cities were really the pioneers in using CCTV. What are some good examples of smart cities in the UK? You know, we have a national government investment in Future Cities Catapult, which I think is more than £100 million toward their projects in cities like Birmingham and Glasgow. Is there one that stands out in your mind as maybe the leader in embracing the approach to smart cities that you're advocating here?
So not one, but there are several. So there's a kind of list of those that are the usual front run.
I hope we didn't lose our connection with you. Well, we may have lost our connection with Graham. In that case, hopefully he'll be able to chime back in. But let me address the question of how UK cities are orchestrating and organizing themselves across their geographical boundaries. And hopefully Graham can join us back in a moment. The Future Cities Catapult, for those who don't know it, is a particularly interesting experiment that has now had a couple of years. Graham, are you back with us?
Well, I can certainly still hear and see you, Gordon.
Okay, good. So go ahead, Graham, back to you.
Yeah, so I was just saying in terms of UK cities, two things. One is there are more CCTV cameras in the UK than I think anywhere else. You know, it used to say you get seen and filmed 10 times a day in London. I think that's a vast underestimation. Back to the city side, so Bristol's one example, Glasgow's looking at it from a more business as usual perspective. I think that's quite important. So they're looking at waste systems and trying to deal with real financial issues and challenges in cities. London, I mentioned earlier in terms of the data strategy. Clearly London's a very complicated city in terms of how you tackle it. Manchester, another very good example of UK city, particularly in terms of the use of data. So those would be the ones, and Peterborough also, one of the other demonstrators that are advanced and pushing the boundaries. I think also, shall we say contextually, from a government perspective, the UK government 2 years ago put a strategy out, and they've consistently pushed and ran competitions, Internet of Things, the recent one, to try and engage and provoke the market into action. They're one of the 6 nations that I deal with in terms of the 6 Nations Smart Cities Forum, that I think is doing well at a national level in terms of trying to set the market stall up correctly.
And now maybe you can speak to Asia, since we're going to be convening in Singapore in mid-July, July 13 to be exact, during the full week of Smart Cities activities that the Singapore government is organizing. We have a one-day forum, the World Smart Cities Forum, and it'll be several hundred of us gathered there to discuss not just one geography like Europe or UK, but also the rest of the world. So could you make the same comments about Asia? Are there any cities that stand out in your mind as really pioneers, perhaps Singapore or perhaps elsewhere?
So Singapore for sure, Gordon. Singapore has always been at the front. Has always been at the front in terms of innovation. They work with academia, MIT and such like, and they are approaching a variety of different domains of cities in a very progressive way. They're not the only one. I'm not as traveled in the Asia-Pacific area of late as several others. So I'm probably less current, which is why I'm not citing cities. Best to speak to what one knows, but I do read a reasonable amount. I think that for me, the excitement of what is going on in India and China in terms of real scale innovation is, I think, both a challenge and an enormous opportunity for reasons. Geographical area, I think, which is worthwhile is good old Australia. They've now got a minister for smart cities. They do some good things and don't realize it. But I think Australia and New Zealand as well just kind of get on with it. They're like the Spaniards of the Asia Pacific area to a certain extent. And for sure, Japan, Korea, some of these other nations which I haven't visited solidly for a while, I think there's some hidden innovations in there, particularly in the area of data and mobile technologies, which we can learn from enormously. And I think Singapore is an opportunity to have and learn.
Good suggestions here. And we have one question about Eastern Europe. Do you have any cities that stand out in Eastern Europe that you would want us to highlight during this discussion?
To be absolutely frank, no. That's possibly through lack of information. I do work quite a bit with the European Commission, so I'm cited in terms of where innovations are coming from across Europe. There are undoubtedly some cities in the eastern member states Ljubljana, as an example, is doing some wonderful things in terms of circular economy and waste. And that approach is recognized at a European level. So they are European leaders in these sorts of things. The extent to which they're applying technology to that, I'm less familiar with. But what I do see is a lot of innovation on the business side from the Eastern European countries. So the delightful strawberry tree, new smart lighting solutions and energy solutions, which were really interesting blends of architecture, design, and technology from Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, these sorts of countries. So I incredibly well educated, and I think they're a source of innovation from the business side, which is providing the world with opportunity. The extent to which they're plugging it into cities there, I'm less cited on, but hopefully there's a project going on at the moment with the Commission to look at examples of smart cities and best practice across the whole of Europe. Hopefully that will flush out quite rapidly some good examples that we can project onto a map.
Good, that's very helpful. And we have about 8 minutes left, so I want to make sure to address any other questions that come in. We'll have an opportunity, of course, to move questions toward you after the event, but while we still have you, one question that came up is about the themes that you would like to see and the topics that you would like to see addressed during the July event in Singapore. We have 4 big topic areas: the urban mobility agenda that you were addressing, the urban energy agenda, and the role of standards and the digital evolution, the urban water agenda, and then a 4th, which is to touch on this privacy and security of data, the cyber agenda. But there are some things, obviously, that are like the golden thread that connect all 4 of those, so I don't want to neglect asking you if there are any topics under those 4 headings, or maybe something that that weaves it all together that we should absolutely be sure to address when we're gathered in Singapore.
Yeah, so I do think there's an opportunity. I mean, it's like any of these things. Cities are connected and they're big and they're hairy and there's lots of opportunities. I do think that there's some areas which absolutely warrant attention. I think health and well-being is one that is a growing massive challenge for cities. And has huge transformational opportunities through digitization. So I think that's one. I think another topic which is foundational is, I mentioned it earlier, asset management. Cities actually knowing what they own, where it is, what state of play it's in. So I think asset management is one of those enablers. I think how cities, so I'm going to mention 4, that's 2 of them, how cities engage and understand society. I think that all cities in the world could get better at that, so that they can actually get people to participate. So the mechanisms that are used there, a lot of which are data and digitally rich, I think is vital. And the final, and probably the most important one for me, is leadership. And I don't mean leadership in terms of the mayor. I mean leadership in terms of a cohort of public, private, and third sector parties. How does that work? Because there is no smart city without.
Very helpful, as usual, Graham. Your answers are better than the questions in most cases, so thanks for that. We have obviously with only a few minutes left, maybe time for one more question. So I'll use my moderator's prerogative to ask you the question, and it's you know, really your honest assessment of how technology companies are addressing this. So a lot of technology companies, IBM, Cisco, Siemens, the list goes on, including your former employer at Capgemini, they're standing up and saying that they have the solution for smart cities, and if only those cities were smart enough, they would adopt that solution, and then the problems would be solved. That's maybe a crass way of saying that perhaps the technology-oriented approach, you know, has its limits. That's my own point of view, and I guess I'm sharing my point of view in order elicit your response. Do you think that the technology companies are offering things that have great value to the cities yet, or maybe if not yet, will that come soon? Or how do you see the whole relationship between the tech provider and the city that's trying to improve the performance of their operations?
Several years ago, I was in the middle of the desert building a very large refinery, and the instrument engineer would be 80% of my problem and 14% of my budget. And when he learned that, it helped both of us. I think that the technology companies have some are mature in terms of their conversation, some are collaborative in terms of their style. Those that are will do well. Those that work with the small and medium technology companies will do well. Some aren't. I think that city building and city fixing and city transformation will not come from the technology companies. I think it will come from the city service providers. So I think that the people that are dealing with real services in the field are far more credible with cities. And I'm seeing the technology companies align with and get behind those types of companies more. I'm seeing the large OEM and equipment manufacturers playing a more important role. Again, for me, it's about the behaviors of these organizations. That is a very telling point, and I would offer as a final thought that the concept of demand aggregation, if tech companies or big companies could just figure out how to work with aggregated demand, with cities together in collaboration, then actually, and I think that's an opportunity for all the private sector to work to, and also for cities to go along with too. I think that will transform things at the pace that's required, as opposed to the pace, unfortunately, we're taking at the moment.
Well, that's a good way to close our discussion. And Graham, thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of the participants from near and far. We had some from Asia, some from Europe, some from North America, and that's very helpful to see the kind of active participation. We're going to be posting this on YouTube, so those who would like to see the link to the YouTube site, as well as the link to the downloadable presentation, can go at the worldsmartcity.org Hangouts, which is worldsmartcity.org/groups/hangouts, and it'll be visible there. And Graham can be reached on the top slide of that is Graham's contact information, where he can be reached by email. And my hope, of course, Graham, is that this is the beginning of a conversation with you that will continue the conversation online with the World Smart Cities Forum online community over the next 4 months. And then during the summer, we'll have a chance to do this face-to-face in Singapore on July 13th. So, Sylvia, perhaps you have a final word to share with everybody from your base there in the UK. Anything that you want to let everybody know about as we get ready to sign off?
I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who watched and participated and sent their questions over email as well. And we're going to stop broadcasting right now and continue wrapping up the call. And in the meantime, you'll be able to find everything under, as Gordon said, under the Hangouts section. So, really, thank you. Graham, would you like to say goodbye?
Goodbye, everybody, and thank you indeed, Sylvia and Gordon, for setting that up. It's been a pleasure. I hope it's been informative, and look forward to chatting and seeing everybody in Singapore.
And thank you to Peter for joining us as well, quietly but listening. Thank you so much.
Peter. Bye all.
Bye.